Greetings, you're listening to the Cold Call Lawcast, the Minnesota Law School podcast featuring students from the University of Minnesota Law School, the University of St. Thomas School of Law, and the Mitchell-Hamlin School of Law. Welcome everyone to the Cold Call Lawcast. I'm Mitch, a first-year law student at the University of St. Thomas School of Law, and with me are my co-hosts.
Hi, I'm Abby. I'm a 1L at the University of Minnesota Law School.
I'm Anthony. I am a 2L at Mitchell-Hamlin School of Law.
I'm Christina. I am a 2L at the University of Minnesota Law School.
So on today's podcast, we're going to be talking to the Dean of the University of St. Thomas School of Law, Robert Vischer. Thank you, Dean Vischer, for being here.
Great to be here.
So Robert Vischer, he serves as the Dean of the University of St. Thomas Law since 2013 and joined the law school as a professor in 2005. Dean Vischer teaches professional responsibility, torts, class I had with you, family law, foundations of justice, and the religious lawyer. He was voted Professor of the Year by the graduating class of 2008 and 2011, and he received the Dean's Award for Outstanding Teacher in 2007. Dean Vischer came to St. Thomas from St. John's University Law School, where he was a law professor. Before teaching, Dean Vischer was an associate at Kirkland and Ellis in Chicago, where he practiced corporate litigation. You also clerked for three federal judges, Judge David Ebel of the 10th Circuit, Judge Joan Gottschall, is that right, of the Northern District of Illinois, and Judge John Weiss from the Court of Federal Claims. And you received your bachelor's degree from the University of New Orleans and your JD from Harvard Law School, where you were the editor of the Harvard Law Review.
Wow.
I've heard of that.
I've heard, yeah, I've heard of it too. I mean, it's no St. Thomas or anything, but you know,
it's the St. Thomas of the Northeast.
Yeah, exactly. And so you spent a lot of time in Chicago. Then were you?
I did. I grew up outside Chicago, and I clerked there, and I practiced there, and my family's still there.
Excellent. And so, do you want to kind of give us a general overview of your background? I know I gave a pretty brief one, but if you have any other details about where you came from and how you got here?
Yep, I was born in a little town in Iowa called Muscatine, and I lived there till third grade, and then I moved to the Chicago area. And then coming out of college, I was, like a lot of liberal arts majors, I was not entirely sure what to do, and I was weighing options of graduate school in political science, which was my major, graduate school in theology, which has always interested me, and in law school, and I ultimately decided that law school would give me the most options and not put me on a relatively narrow track, so I chose that, and for most of law school, I assumed that I would spend my career in private practice, and I spent the first few years in private practice, and I enjoyed it, but ultimately I was drawn to finding a career path that would let me write about the topics that I was more naturally drawn to, rather than writing about the topics that my clients presented, which I enjoyed as well. I wasn't quite as passionate about it. So I decided to try teaching and pursue the academic vocation, and so that's where I've been for the last 17 years.
Excellent. And did you do anything before you entered law school?
No, I went straight from college to law school.
Okay.
Yeah.
Abby did that. I think
Yep.
Abby's the only one of us that...
Yep.
No, yeah.
Yeah,
and I think, I think students who do take a little bit of time off between college and law school come in with an advantage, because one of the challenges for a first-year law student is simply meeting the demands of a full-time job, which law school is like a full-time job. It doesn't need to be significantly more than a full-time job. But if you're coming out of a relatively cushy senior year experience of college, which not everybody has, but there are a good number of people who have, just that adjustment is a challenge, where people who have been working in the marketplace for a couple years, I think, have a little bit more ability to focus and organize their schedules in kind of coherent and effective ways. So there's a little bit of an advantage there. The downside, of course, is sometimes it's an adjustment getting back into an academic mindset and sitting in class and doing all the reading and stuff. So there's some pros and cons, but I do think if I had to do it over again, I might have taken a year or two off and worked.
Have you seen a shift since from when you were in law school to today in the amount, probably in the percentage of people that get some sort of experience after college?
Yes, I would say that a higher percentage of students take some time between college and law school. And I think it's in keeping with the broader trend where if you go back 25 years, 20 years, 15 years, even 10 years ago, there was more of a perception that law school was a safe bet regardless of how you came in, regardless of where you went. And so it didn't really matter what your experience coming in was or the reasons or motivation you brought to law school. It was all going to turn out fine. Now we've seen as there's much more granular data and transparency. The students coming in know exactly what's going on in law school, and I think it's more of an affirmative particular choice rather than a default like me for the poli-sci major who says, well, I might as well go to law school. At least at St. Thomas, we don't see that frequently at all. And in keeping with that, I think students are more likely to say, let me take a year or two, make sure this is what I want to do, and then I'll jump back in.
And what were some of your best and worst parts of your experience in law school? What did you say that law school was again?
It was the St. Thomas of the Northeast.
Okay.
So I went to Harvard, and there's lots of impressions that people have of Harvard, some good, some negative. I had an overall really good experience. The best parts were the other students. I made great friendships, and it's a pretty big, it's a very big school, so you can find your circles and really build some great experiences going as you can, I think, in just about any law school of going through sort of the difficult experience together. It's a tremendously bonding experience. So I think the friendships were the highlight. Probably the negative part, Harvard, at least at this time, I think they've tried to change it. It was not what I would call a student-centered culture, right? Like, I think all the law schools represented in this room are more student-centered. I, of course, am biased, so I think St. Thomas is the most student-centered. But it was, faculty would teach their classes, and they were great teachers for the most part. But they weren't that interested, in my experience, in building relationships with students outside class. And I remember one experience I had where I had taken the federal courts course, and I'd done well in the course, and it wasn't even that big of a class. But at the end of the class, I went to see the professor to ask for a letter of recommendation, and I still remember him sort of looking at me over his glasses, and he said, I don't know you. And I said, well, I just finished the course with you. I participated some. Maybe I should have come to see you earlier, but, I'd be happy to tell you about myself, and I did well in your course. And then he sort of cut off the conversation. He said, no, I don't know you. You're going to have to ask somebody else.
Wow.
And not every professor took it to that extreme, but I would say at that time, and I think it's changed for the better, but at that time, you were there, but you weren't the focus of attention. The faculty were doing their own thing, and they would teach their classes when they needed to, but you weren't going to build strong relationships with them.
Everyone kind of already has like a perception of Harvard as an elite law school or something that's really hard to get into. Do you find that the actual curriculum itself is similar to any other law school, or does it hold its perception of what Harvard is?
In my experience, again, and it could have changed, I think that the faculty were more likely to sort of go into more esoteric flights of fancy in class. So in my torts class, I'm not sure we learned much tort doctrine at all. We learned a lot about economic theories of law that might have played out in different tort scenarios sometimes. And I think I didn't go to Yale. Yale has a reputation on that front that's even more extreme. But I think what you would find is more professors who are going to go deeper into the theories of law and not necessarily worry about what the legal doctrine is or the law that's going to be covered on the bar exam or things like that. That would be one difference. Although there were some courses that were very practical, but just not as many as you would have at most law schools.
When you began your career in teaching law, did having that kind of experience of pedagogy influence the way that you decided to teach, like kind of in the back of your head thinking, oh, I don't want to be like those professors. I want to engage my students more?
Yeah, well, so there was, even beyond Harvard, there was a mindset among many in the academy, and I think it's changed some, that you need to be a little bit standoffish with students. Like when I was my first week of teaching, not at St. Thomas, but a senior member of the faculty stopped by my office and he said, just a warning, you're young, and so the students are going to try to be your friend. What I recommend to you is when you're done teaching, get out of the classroom, come back to your office right away. Don't sort of fall into that trap. And which I thought, well, that's a super depressing vision of teaching.
Yeah.
Like I need to try to avoid any friendships with students. So that's never been my mindset. The other thing I would say is when I started teaching my first year, I kind of thought, well, I'm going to have to start from where the casebook ends and then just, pile on my own theories of what's going on in this legal area. And I quickly realized, no, that's stupid. Teach the casebook, right? That's what they need to know. And so that misimpression lasted about a week. And then that's what I've been doing since then.
And so you think probably law schools have turned more practical in their approach of law and less theoretical?
Well, it's hard to speak for every law school. One of the realizations that led to a significant downturn in law school applications starting, 8 years ago was changes in the ABA disclosure policies where employment data became much more granular. Prior to that, every law school, their employment numbers were 90% plus because all you were asked by the ABA is what's the percentage of your graduates who have jobs, right? Mm-hmm. And under the data, we didn't know they could be a barista or they could be, an associate at the top law firm, and it's all in that 93% numbers. And that's what people saw. That's what we saw. The ABA then changed the requirements where it breaks it down to a very granular level, which was a great move. And then you suddenly realize, the percentage of graduates who are coming out and actually getting JD required or JD preferred full-time, long-term jobs is relatively low. And that required a shift in mindset for a lot of law schools of saying, holy cow, we've got to get more of our graduates into these law jobs. At the same time, with the recession of 2008, that wasn't the only factor, but it was a factor where in-house legal departments are under pressure to reduce their legal spend, and they're telling firms, we are not going to be paying this amount of an hourly rate for you to have a first-year associate who doesn't know what they're doing, just churning hours on our matter. And so law firms came under a lot more pressure to, when they are doing that hiring, to make sure that associates are practice ready and ready to contribute in meaningful ways. So that whole confluence of factors put a lot more pressure on law schools to make sure they're putting their graduates in a position to get good law jobs where they can produce. And so you're seeing a lot more emphasis on experiential learning, clinics, externships, practicum courses. At the